The auctioneer's voice carried across the humid Alabama afternoon, but it lacked the usual enthusiasm, the practiced showmanship that typically accompanied slave sales. Instead, there was a note of wariness, almost reluctance, as he gestured toward me standing on the auction block. "This here is Samuel," he announced to the sparse crowd of potential buyers. 32 years old, strong, healthy, experienced in fieldwork, animal husbandry, and general plantation management. Starting bid is, well, let's start at $200. $200 for a prime-age male slave with my skills and experience. That was insultingly low. The going rate should have been at least $800, maybe $1,000, but everyone in that crowd knew why the price was so low, why the auctioneer seemed almost apologetic about offering me for sale. They knew about the curse. My name is Samuel, and I am the most dangerous slave in the South, not because I'm violent, not because I run away, not because I rebel in any obvious way. I'm dangerous because every master who's ever owned me has been financially destroyed within 2 years of purchasing me. 4 masters, 4 fortunes lost, 4 proud plantation owners reduced to bankruptcy and ruin. And no one has ever figured out that it wasn't a curse. It was me. Master William Thornton was the first, back in 1845 when I was 23 years old. He'd bought me at auction in Mobile, paid top dollar for a young, strong field hand who seemed intelligent and capable. He put me to work in his cotton fields, and I worked hard, efficiently. Never complained, never caused trouble. But within 18 months, Master Thornton's plantation was failing. His cotton yields dropped mysteriously despite good weather and adequate rainfall. His prize-breeding horses developed strange ailments that left them lethargic and unproductive. His investments in railroad stocks, investments he'd made based on advice from various sources, including casual conversations with me where I'd mentioned hearing things about which companies were promising, turned out to be spectacularly bad choices. By early 1847, Master Thornton was bankrupt. He sold his plantation, his slaves, everything he owned, and moved to Texas to start over. And I was sold to Master James Whitfield, a wealthy cotton broker in Mississippi. Master Whitfield lasted only 14 months. His warehouse mysteriously developed a mold problem that ruined thousands of dollars worth of stored cotton. His business partnership soured when deals I'd helped arrange. By carrying messages, by being present during negotiations, by offering my simple slave's perspective on various matters, turned out to be disadvantageous. His prize bull died from what the veterinarian called natural causes, but what I knew was the result of a carefully administered diet that had slowly weakened the animal's heart. By the end of 1848, Master Whitfield was ruined, and I was sold again, this time to Master Robert Ashford in Georgia. Master Ashford was more cautious, had heard rumors about the cursed slave who'd bankrupted 2 previous owners, but he was also arrogant, convinced that superstition was for the ignorant, that he was too smart and too careful to fall victim to whatever had destroyed Thornton and Whitfield. He lasted 16 months. His tobacco crop failed due to a pest infestation that I'd secretly encouraged by creating ideal breeding conditions. His new irrigation system, which I'd helped design and install, had subtle flaws that caused long-term soil degradation. His expansion into new markets, based partly on information I'd provided about what I'd heard other slaves saying about demand in various regions, turned out to be disastrously timed. By mid-1850, Master Ashford was bankrupt, and I was sold for the 4th time, now carrying a reputation that made me nearly unsellable, that had driven my price down to a fraction of what I should have been worth. "The curse is real," people whispered at the auction. 4 masters, all ruined. There's something wrong with that slave, something evil. No one should buy him. But there's always someone willing to take a risk, always someone who thinks they're smarter than everyone else, who believes they can succeed where others have failed. And on that humid Alabama afternoon in August 1850, that someone was Master Edmund Blackwood. He was a large man in his 40s, prosperous and confident, owner of a successful cotton plantation 20 miles outside Montgomery. He stood at the edge of the crowd, studying me with calculating eyes, clearly weighing the risk against the potential reward of buying a skilled slave at a bargain price. $200, he called out, his voice booming across the auction yard. "I'll take him." The auctioneer looked relieved. "Sold, to Master Blackwood for $200. As I was led off the auction block, as the chains were transferred from the auctioneer to Master Blackwood's overseer, I caught Master Blackwood's eye. He was smiling, pleased with his purchase, confident that he'd gotten a bargain, that the curse was just superstition, that he was too smart to fall victim to whatever had destroyed my previous masters. And I smiled back, a small, subtle expression that could have been interpreted as gratitude, as relief at being purchased, as the appropriate response of a slave to his new master. But it wasn't gratitude, it wasn't relief, it was anticipation, because Master Edmund Blackwood had just made the worst financial decision of his life. He'd just purchased a slave who was going to systematically, methodically, invisibly destroy everything he'd built, who was going to drive him to financial ruin without stealing a single dime, without destroying a single piece of property in any obvious way, without doing anything that could be traced back to deliberate sabotage. I was going to do to Master Blackwood exactly what I'd done to Masters Thornton, Whitfield, and Ashford. I was going to be the perfect slave, loyal, hard-working, helpful, always offering advice and assistance, always trying to make things better. And in the process, I was going to destroy him, because that was my revenge. Not violent rebellion, not running away, not any of the obvious forms of resistance that would get me killed or sold further south into even worse conditions. My revenge was subtle, patient, sophisticated, the kind of resistance that no one suspected, that looked like bad luck or poor judgment or natural misfortune. My revenge was making my masters fail, making them lose everything, making them suffer the way they'd made countless enslaved people suffer, by taking away their security, their prosperity, their futures. And I was very, very good at it. As the wagon carried me toward Master Blackwood's plantation, as I began mentally cataloguing the ways I would undermine his success, as I prepared to begin the careful, patient work of destruction, I thought about why I did this, about what had turned me into the weapon I'd become. It had started with my father. He'd been a skilled blacksmith, valuable and respected within the limited world of plantation slavery. But when he'd tried to buy his freedom, had saved money for years, had made a fair offer to his master, he'd been refused, mocked, told that no slave deserved freedom, no matter how much money they accumulated. And then to punish him for his presumption, for daring to imagine he could buy his way out of bondage. His master had sold him away from his family, had separated him from my mother and me and my siblings, had destroyed our family as casually as someone might swat a fly. I was 12 years old when they took my father away, and I swore that day that I would make masters pay, would make them suffer, would find a way to hurt them that they couldn't defend against because they wouldn't even know it was happening. It took me years to develop my methods, to learn how to sabotage without being detected, to understand the economics and agriculture and animal husbandry well enough to know how to make things fail in ways that looked natural. But I'd learned, had practiced, had refined my techniques until I'd become what I was now, a weapon disguised as a slave, a destroyer disguised as a helper, a curse disguised as bad luck. And Master Edmund Blackwood was about to discover, though he would never understand it, would never realize what was really happening, that buying me was the beginning of his end. The cursed slave had found his fifth victim, and the cycle of subtle, invisible, devastating revenge was about to begin again. Master Blackwood's plantation was impressive, 1,500 acres of prime cotton land, a grand house with white columns, extensive outbuildings, and 132 slaves working in carefully organized operations. Everything spoke of prosperity, efficiency, success built over 2 generations of Blackwood family ownership. It was perfect. The higher they stood, the further they had to fall. And I was going to push Master Blackwood off his pedestal so gradually, so subtly, that he would never see it coming. "You'll work in the fields initially," the overseer, a hard man named Cyrus Webb, told me on my first day. "Master Blackwood wants to observe you, see if this curse nonsense has any truth to it. You cause any problems, you'll answer to me and my whip." "Yes, sir," I said, keeping my voice humble, deferential. "I just want to work hard, 'cause no trouble. I don't know nothing about any curse. I just had bad luck with my previous masters, I suppose. I worked in the fields for 3 weeks, picking cotton alongside the other slaves, demonstrating that I was strong, capable, hard-working. I made no mistakes, caused no problems. showed no signs of being anything other than a valuable field hand who'd been unfairly stigmatized by coincidence and superstition. And I observed. I studied the plantation's operations, identified the systems and processes that made it successful, looked for vulnerabilities and opportunities, planned how I would begin my work of subtle destruction. Master Blackwood visited the fields regularly, observing his slaves, checking on progress, demonstrating the hands-on management style that had made him successful. And he paid particular attention to me, clearly watching for any sign that I was the source of the curse that had destroyed my previous masters. "You're a good worker, Samuel," he said to me one afternoon, his tone almost friendly. "I don't see any evidence of this curse people talk about. I think you were just unlucky, ended up with masters who made poor decisions and then blamed you for their failures." "Thank you, Master," I said. "I hope to serve you well for many years." "I'm sure you will," Master Blackwood said confidently. "I'm not superstitious like some people. I judge slaves by their work, not by rumors and gossip." After a month, Master Blackwood promoted me to a position of more responsibility, working with the livestock, helping to manage the plantation's horses, cattle, and pigs. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for, exactly the kind of access I needed to begin my real work. "You seem to know animals," Master Blackwood observed, watching me work with one of his prize breeding mares. "Where did you learn that?" "My father was a blacksmith master," I said, which was true. "He worked with horses all the time, taught me how to handle them, how to read their behavior, how to keep them healthy." "Excellent," Master Blackwood said. "I'm always looking for slaves with specialized skills. You'll work with our head groom, help manage the breeding program. We have some of the finest horses in Alabama, and I want to keep them that way." Perfect. Absolutely perfect. I began my sabotage with the horses, but so subtly that no one would ever suspect deliberate action. I didn't poison them, didn't injure them, didn't do anything that would be obviously harmful. Instead, I made small adjustments to their care that would have long-term negative effects while appearing to be improvements. I changed their feed mixture slightly, adding more corn and less oats, a change that would make them gain weight and look healthy in the short term, but would reduce their stamina and performance over time. I adjusted their exercise routines in ways that would build the wrong muscle groups, making them look impressive but actually reducing their value as working or racing animals. I recommended breeding combinations that looked good on paper but would produce offspring with subtle genetic weaknesses. And I did it all while appearing to be the perfect groom, the knowledgeable slave who was improving the horse program, who was making Master Blackwood's valuable animals even more valuable. "The horses look better than ever," Master Blackwood told me after 3 months. "You've done excellent work, Samuel. I'm glad I didn't listen to those superstitious fools who said you were cursed." "Thank you, Master," I said. "I just tried to do my best." But while I was sabotaging the horse program, I was also gathering information about Master Blackwood's other operations, his business dealings, his financial decisions. And I was looking for opportunities to offer helpful advice that would actually lead him toward poor choices. The opportunity came when Master Blackwood mentioned that he was considering investing in new agricultural equipment, specifically a new type of cotton plow that was being marketed as revolutionary, capable of increasing yields by 30%. "What do you think, Samuel?" he asked me one evening, showing me a brochure for the new plow. He'd gotten into the habit of asking my opinion on various matters, valuing what he called my practical slave's perspective on agricultural issues. I studied the brochure carefully, noting the design, the claims, the price, and I recognized immediately that it was a scam. The plow would work in the short term, but would cause long-term soil compaction and degradation that would reduce yields for years to come. "It looks very impressive, Master," I said enthusiastically. "I heard some slaves from the Morrison plantation talking about it. They said their master bought several, and the cotton came up real thick and healthy. Maybe you should invest in them, get ahead of your competitors." This was a lie. I'd heard no such thing. But Master Blackwood trusted me, believed that I was simply reporting what I'd heard, that I had no agenda beyond being helpful. "Interesting," Master Blackwood said, his interest clearly piqued. "If Morrison is using them successfully, maybe I should consider it. The investment is significant, but if it increases yields by even 20%, it would pay for itself in 2 seasons. Yes, Master, I agreed. Seems like a smart investment to me. Master Blackwood bought 6 of the new plows, spending a substantial sum on equipment that I knew would damage his soil and reduce his long-term productivity. And he thanked me for the advice, praised me for being observant and helpful, never suspecting that I'd just convinced him to make a decision that would cost him thousands of dollars. I continued this pattern over the following months, offering advice that seemed helpful but was actually destructive, making suggestions that appeared to be in Master Blackwood's best interest but were actually designed to undermine his success. When he asked about the best time to sell his cotton crop, I told him that I'd heard prices were going to rise in the spring, convincing him to hold his cotton rather than selling it immediately. In reality, I knew from careful observation of market patterns that prices were likely to fall, and they did, costing Master Blackwood significant revenue. When he considered expanding his operations into a new field, I enthusiastically supported the idea, knowing that the soil in that field was poor and would require expensive amendments to be productive. The expansion ended up costing far more than projected and producing far less than expected. When he asked about which slaves should be assigned to which tasks, I made recommendations that seemed logical but actually placed people in positions where they would be less efficient, where their skills would be underutilized, where productivity would suffer. And through it all, I maintained my reputation as a loyal, helpful, knowledgeable slave who was trying his best to serve his master well. Master Blackwood trusted me, relied on my advice, valued my input. He never suspected that every suggestion I made, every piece of advice I offered, every observation I shared was carefully calculated to lead him toward failure. The other slaves noticed something was happening, noticed that I seemed to have unusual influence with Master Blackwood, that he consulted me on important decisions. Some resented it, saw me as trying to curry favor with the master. Others were curious, wondered what I was doing, what my game was. But I told no one about my methods, shared my secrets with no one, because the moment anyone knew what I was really doing, the moment my sabotage became obvious, I would be exposed, punished, probably killed. My revenge only worked because it was invisible, because it looked like bad luck and poor judgment rather than deliberate action. By the end of my first year on the Blackwood plantation, the signs of decline were beginning to show. The horses were less valuable than they'd been, their performance declining in ways that puzzled the buyers who'd previously been eager to purchase Blackwood breeding stock. The new plows had initially increased yields, but were now causing problems. The soil was becoming compacted, drainage was poor, and the cotton plants were struggling. Master Blackwood's investments were underperforming. His expansion into new fields was costing more than it was producing, and his overall profitability was declining, despite his hard work and careful management. "I don't understand it," he said to his wife one evening as I served their dinner. "Everything should be working. I'm making good decisions, following sound business practices, investing wisely. But somehow, the plantation isn't as profitable as it should be. It's like I'm cursed with bad luck." I kept my face neutral, showed no reaction to his words, but inside I was smiling, because Master Blackwood was beginning to feel what I wanted him to feel: confusion, frustration, the growing sense that something was wrong but not understanding what or why. The curse was working. And Master Blackwood still had no idea that the curse had a name, a face, a deliberate intelligence behind it. The curse was me, and I was just getting started. By the spring of 1851, 9 months after Master Blackwood had purchased me, the plantation's decline was becoming more obvious. The problems were still subtle enough that they could be attributed to bad luck or market conditions, but they were accumulating, compounding, creating a pattern of underperformance that was starting to worry Master Blackwood. His horses were selling for less than they used to, buyers complaining that the animals lacked stamina or had temperamental issues. His cotton yields were down 15% from the previous year, despite good weather and adequate rainfall. His investments in railroad stocks, investments I'd encouraged by mentioning rumors I'd supposedly heard from other slaves about which companies were expanding, had lost significant value, and Master Blackwood was beginning to show signs of stress. I could see it in his face, in the way he snapped at his overseers, in the long hours he spent in his study reviewing account books and trying to understand where his profits were going. But he still trusted me, still valued my advice, still saw me as one of his most loyal and helpful slaves, someone who was trying to make the plantation successful rather than someone who was systematically destroying it. "Samuel," he called to me one afternoon, summoning me to his study. "I need your opinion on something." I entered the study, stood respectfully near the door, waited for him to speak. He was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and ledgers, looking tired and frustrated. "The plantation isn't performing as well as it should," he said bluntly. "I'm trying to figure out why. You work closely with the animals. You observe the field operations. You hear things from the other slaves. What do you think is wrong? What am I missing?" This was a dangerous moment. If I appeared too knowledgeable, too analytical, I might raise suspicions. But if I appeared too ignorant, I might lose the influence I'd cultivated. I needed to strike exactly the right balance, helpful but not threatening, observant but not too intelligent, offering insights that seemed to come from a slave's limited perspective, rather than from sophisticated understanding. "Well, Master," I said carefully, "I don't know much about business and such, but I have noticed some things. The horses seem healthy, but they're not as spirited as they used to be. Maybe it's the feed, or maybe they need more exercise. I'm not sure." "The feed is the same as it's always been," Master Blackwood said, which wasn't quite true. I'd made subtle changes that he hadn't noticed. "What else?" "The cotton," I continued. "It's growing, but the plants seem, I don't know how to describe it, weaker, like they're struggling more than they should be. Maybe it's the soil, or maybe those new plows are doing something we don't understand." Master Blackwood frowned. "The plows are supposed to improve yields, not reduce them. The manufacturer guaranteed they would increase productivity." "Yes, Master," I said. "I'm sure they know what they're talking about. I'm just a slave. I don't understand these things like educated people do. I'm probably wrong." But I'd planted the seed of doubt. Master Blackwood was now thinking about the plows, wondering if maybe they weren't as beneficial as he'd been told, starting to question the investment I'd encouraged him to make. "What about the other slaves?" Master Blackwood asked. "Are they working as hard as they should? Are there problems I'm not aware of?" "Everyone works hard, Master," I said, which was true. But maybe some people are in the wrong jobs. Like there's a man named Isaac who's working in the fields, but he used to be a carpenter. Maybe he'd be more useful building things. And there's a woman named Ruth who's working in the kitchen, but she's really good with numbers. She used to help her old master with accounts. Maybe she could help with record keeping. These suggestions seemed helpful. Seemed like I was trying to optimize the plantation's operations. But I knew that moving Isaac to carpentry would actually reduce field productivity more than it would increase building efficiency. He was a mediocre carpenter, but an excellent field hand. And putting Ruth in charge of record keeping would introduce subtle errors and inefficiencies because, while she was good with numbers, she had no formal training in accounting and would make mistakes that would compound over time. "Interesting suggestions," Master Blackwood said, making notes. "I'll consider them. You're observant, Samuel. You notice things that others miss. That's valuable." "Thank you, Master," I said. "I just want to help make the plantation successful." Over the next few months, I continued my campaign of subtle sabotage, always appearing helpful, always offering advice that seemed sound, but was actually destructive. When Master Blackwood asked about expanding into tobacco cultivation, diversifying his crops to reduce risk, I enthusiastically supported the idea, knowing that the soil and climate on his plantation were poorly suited for tobacco, and that the venture would be expensive and unprofitable. When he considered purchasing additional slaves to increase productivity, I suggested buying from a particular slave trader who I knew sold people who were sick or troublesome, people who would cost more in medical care and management than they would produce in labor. When he asked about the best way to store his cotton to preserve quality, I recommended a method that seemed logical but would actually increase the risk of moisture damage and pest infestation. And Master Blackwood followed my advice, trusted my suggestions, implemented my recommendations, because I'd established myself as loyal and helpful, because my advice seemed to come from practical experience rather than sophisticated knowledge, because he couldn't imagine that a slave would be capable of the kind of sophisticated, long-term sabotage I was executing. By the fall of 1851, 18 months after Master Blackwood had purchased me, the plantation was in serious trouble. Cotton yields were down 25%. The horse breeding program was producing animals that sold for half what they used to command. The tobacco venture had been a complete failure, losing thousands of dollars. The new slaves Master Blackwood had purchased were proving to be more trouble than they were worth, and Master Blackwood was becoming desperate, frustrated, unable to understand why everything he touched seemed to turn to failure despite his experience and careful management. "It's the curse," I heard one of the overseers say to another. "That slave, Samuel, he's cursed. Every master who's owned him has been ruined. Master Blackwood should sell him before it's too late." But Master Blackwood refused to believe in the curse, refused to accept that superstition could explain his failures. He was a rational man, an educated man, someone who believed in cause and effect, in logical explanations, in the power of good management to overcome obstacles. "There's no such thing as a curse," he told his wife one evening, his voice sharp with frustration. "I'm making mistakes somehow, missing something, failing to see problems that should be obvious. But it's not because of some supernatural curse. It's because I'm not managing well enough, not making the right decisions." And that was exactly what I wanted him to think, that his failures were his own fault, that he was inadequate, that he was failing despite his best efforts. Because that kind of self-doubt, that kind of internalized failure, was more destructive than any external blame could ever be. I continued my work through the winter of 1851 and into the spring of 1852. I sabotaged carefully, subtly, always maintaining my cover as the loyal, helpful slave who was trying his best to serve his master well. And I watched Master Blackwood decline, not just financially but emotionally and psychologically. He became irritable, short-tempered, prone to angry outbursts. He drank more, slept less, spent long hours in his study trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong, how he could reverse his fortunes. His wife began to resent him, began to blame him for the declining lifestyle, for the reduced luxuries, for the growing debts. His neighbors began to whisper about his failures, about how the once successful Blackwood plantation was falling apart under his management. And through it all I remained the constant presence, the helpful slave, the loyal servant who was always there, offering advice and assistance, never suspected of being the architect of the destruction I was witnessing. By the summer of 1852, 2 years after Master Blackwood had purchased me, the plantation was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Master Blackwood still had no idea that the curse was real, that it had a name and a face and a deliberate intelligence behind it. The curse was me, and I was about to complete my work, about to drive my 5th master to financial ruin, about to prove once again that I was the most dangerous slave in the South, not because of violence or rebellion, but because of patience, intelligence, and the subtle art of making masters destroy themselves. The collapse, when it finally came, was swift and total. 2 years of accumulated sabotage, 2 years of subtle undermining, 2 years of carefully orchestrated failure. It all came crashing down in the summer of 1852, like a house built on sand, finally succumbing to the tide. Master Blackwood's cotton crop failed catastrophically. The soil, damaged by 2 years of the destructive plows I'd convinced him to buy, simply couldn't support healthy plant growth anymore. The cotton came up sparse and weak, the bolls small and inferior. The harvest was less than half of what it should have been, barely enough to cover the costs of cultivation. His horse breeding program, once the pride of the plantation, was in ruins. The animals I'd been caring for were lethargic, temperamental, unsuitable for the demanding work or racing that buyers wanted. Several of his best breeding mares had produced offspring with subtle genetic defects, nothing obvious enough to blame on deliberate action, but enough to make the animals nearly worthless. His tobacco venture, which I'd enthusiastically encouraged, had been a complete disaster. The crop had been attacked by pests, had suffered from poor soil conditions, had produced leaves that were bitter and unmarketable. He'd lost thousands of dollars on an expansion that had seemed promising, but had been doomed from the start. And his financial investments, guided partly by rumors and information I'd provided, had performed disastrously. The railroad stocks I'd encouraged him to buy had plummeted in value. The business partnerships I'd helped arrange had turned sour. The expansion into new markets I'd supported had cost far more than it had generated. By August 1852, Master Blackwood was deeply in debt, unable to pay his creditors, facing the very real possibility of losing everything he'd built over 2 generations of family ownership. I watched it all unfold with a satisfaction that I kept carefully hidden behind my mask of loyal servitude. I watched Master Blackwood age years in months, watched him become a shadow of the confident, prosperous man who'd bought me 2 years earlier, watched him struggle with the realization that he was failing, that everything he touched was turning to disaster. "I don't understand," he said to me one evening, his voice hollow with despair. We were in the barn, where I was supposedly tending to the horses, but was actually observing the final stages of his collapse. "I've done everything right. I've worked hard, made careful decisions, followed sound business practices, but everything has failed. Every investment, every venture, every decision, it's all gone wrong." "I'm sorry, Master," I said, my voice filled with false sympathy. "Sometimes things just don't work out, no matter how hard we try." "It's the curse," Master Blackwood said, and I was startled to hear him finally acknowledge what he dismissed as superstition for 2 years. "That's what people said when I bought you. They said you were cursed, that every master who owned you was ruined. I didn't believe them. I thought I was too smart, too careful, too rational to fall victim to superstition, but maybe they were right. Maybe you really are cursed." "I don't know about curses, Master," I said carefully. "I just know that I've tried my best to serve you well, to help make the plantation successful. If I've failed you, I'm sorry." "You haven't failed me," Master Blackwood said, and the irony of his words was almost too much to bear. "You've been one of my most loyal slaves, always helpful, always trying to make things better. If anything, you're the only one I can trust, the only one who's been consistently trying to help rather than just doing the minimum required." I had to turn away to hide my expression, had to pretend to be adjusting a horse's bridle to conceal the smile that threatened to break through my carefully maintained facade. Because Master Blackwood had just articulated the perfect success of my sabotage, he trusted me completely, saw me as loyal and helpful, never suspected that I was the architect of his destruction. The final blow came in September, when Master Blackwood's creditors demanded payment and he couldn't meet his obligations. The bank foreclosed on his loans, his suppliers refused to extend further credit, and his neighbors, who'd been whispering about his failures for months, declined to help him. He was forced to sell. The plantation, the house, the land, the equipment, the slaves, everything had to go to pay his debts. And even then, even after selling everything he owned, Master Blackwood would be left with almost nothing, would have to start over from near poverty, would spend the rest of his life trying to recover from the catastrophic failure that had destroyed him. The auction was held on a cold October morning, with buyers coming from across Alabama to pick over the remains of what had once been one of the most successful plantations in the region. Master Blackwood stood to the side, his face gray with grief and humiliation, watching as his life's work was sold piece by piece to strangers. And I stood on the auction block once again, waiting to be sold for the 5th time, carrying the reputation that had become even more firmly established. The cursed slave, the man who destroyed every master who owned him, the walking disaster that no rational person should purchase. "This is Samuel," the auctioneer announced, his voice even more reluctant than it had been 2 years earlier. 34 years old, experienced in fieldwork, animal husbandry, and general plantation management. He comes with a reputation. 5 masters, all ruined within 2 years of purchasing him. Starting bid is $100. $100. Half of what I'd sold for 2 years earlier. A quarter of what I should have been worth based on my skills and experience. The curse had made me nearly worthless, had transformed me from a valuable asset into a liability that no one wanted. But there's always someone who thinks they're smarter than everyone else, who believes they can succeed where others have failed, who sees an opportunity in what others see as a curse. $100, a voice called from the back of the crowd. "I'll take him." I looked toward the voice and saw a man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, probably in his 50s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously wealthy. He had the look of someone who'd been successful but not spectacularly so, someone who was comfortable but always looking for ways to improve his position. "Sold," the auctioneer said quickly, clearly relieved to be rid of me. "To Master." "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't catch your name." "Cornelius Whitmore," the man said, stepping forward. "I own a plantation about 30 miles south of here, and I don't believe in curses." As I was led off the auction block, as the chains were transferred to Master Whitmore's overseer, I caught Master Blackwood's eye one final time. He was watching me with an expression of confused grief, still trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong, still wondering if maybe the curse was real after all. And I allowed myself a small smile, subtle, brief, easily missed or misinterpreted. But Master Blackwood saw it, and I saw recognition flicker in his eyes, saw him begin to wonder, to question, to suspect that maybe, just maybe, the curse wasn't supernatural at all. But it was too late. He was ruined, destroyed, reduced to near poverty, and I was being taken to a new plantation, to a new master, to begin the cycle again, because that was my revenge. Not one dramatic act of rebellion, not one violent confrontation, not one obvious strike against the system that had enslaved me. My revenge was patient, subtle, sophisticated, the kind of resistance that no one suspected, that looked like bad luck, or poor judgment, or natural misfortune. My revenge was making masters fail, making them lose everything, making them suffer the way they'd made countless enslaved people suffer, by taking away their security, their prosperity, their futures. And I was very, very good at it. As the wagon carried me away from the ruins of Master Blackwood's plantation, as I prepared to begin my work on Master Whitmore, as I contemplated the years of careful sabotage that lay ahead, I thought about my father, about the promise I'd made when they'd sold him away from our family. I'd promised to make masters pay, to make them suffer, to find a way to hurt them that they couldn't defend against because they wouldn't even know it was happening. And I'd kept that promise. 5 times now, I'd kept that promise. And I would keep it again and again and again for as long as I lived, for as long as there were masters who thought they could own human beings without consequences. The slave who drove masters to financial ruin without stealing a dime was heading to his next target, and Master Cornelius Whitmore, who didn't believe in curses, was about to learn that some curses were very real indeed. They just had names and faces and deliberate intelligence behind them, and they were far more dangerous than any supernatural force could ever be. Master Cornelius Whitmore's plantation was smaller than Master Blackwood's had been. Only 800 acres, about 70 slaves, a modest house that spoke of comfortable prosperity rather than ostentatious wealth. But it was well managed, profitable, the kind of operation that had sustained the Whitmore family for 3 generations through careful stewardship and conservative business practices. It was exactly the kind of target I preferred. Not too large, not too complex, not so diversified that my sabotage would be diluted across too many operations. A focused, efficient plantation where subtle undermining could have maximum impact. "I don't believe in curses," Master Whitmore told me on my first day, echoing what he'd said at the auction. "I believe in hard work, sound management, and rational decision-making. Whatever happened to your previous masters, Thornton, Whitfield, Ashford, Blackwood, it wasn't because of you, it was because they made poor choices, took unnecessary risks, failed to adapt to changing conditions." "Yes, Master," I said, keeping my voice humble, deferential. "I just want to work hard and serve you well. That's all I ask," Master Whitmore said. "Work hard, follow instructions, cause no trouble. Do that, and we'll get along fine." I worked in the fields initially, as I always did with new masters, demonstrating my capabilities, establishing my value, showing that I was a skilled and reliable worker. And I observed, studied the plantation's operations, identified vulnerabilities and opportunities, began planning how I would begin my work of destruction. Master Whitmore was more cautious than my previous masters had been, more conservative in his decision-making, less likely to take risks or make dramatic changes. That would make my work more challenging, would require more patience and subtlety, would demand that I be even more careful about how I offered advice and influenced decisions, but it also meant that when I did succeed in undermining him, when I did manage to drive him to ruin, the satisfaction would be even greater. Because destroying a careful, conservative, rational man would prove that my methods worked against any type of master, that no amount of caution or prudence could protect against the kind of sabotage I practiced. I began slowly, carefully, testing Master Whitmore's trust, establishing myself as a valuable worker who could be relied upon for more than just field labor. And within 3 months, I'd been promoted to working with the livestock, helping to manage the plantation's cattle and pigs, exactly the kind of access I needed to begin my real work. "You're good with animals," Master Whitmore observed, watching me work with one of his breeding sows. "Better than most. Where did you learn that?" "My father taught me, Master," I said, giving the same answer I always gave. "He worked with animals all his life, passed his knowledge on to me." "Well, I'm glad to have you," Master Whitmore said. "Good animal husbandry is essential to a profitable plantation. You'll work with our head stockman, help improve our breeding program." And so it began. The subtle adjustments to feed and care that would reduce animal health and productivity over time. The breeding recommendations that would produce inferior offspring. The small changes to management practices that would increase costs and reduce efficiency. All of it invisible, all of it deniable, all of it looking like natural variation or bad luck rather than deliberate sabotage. But I also began offering advice on other matters, carefully positioning myself as someone whose practical slave's perspective could be valuable to Master Whitmore's decision-making. "Master," I said one day, about 6 months after arriving at the plantation, "I heard some slaves from the Johnson plantation talking about a new type of fertilizer their master is using. They say it's made the cotton grow twice as thick. Maybe you should look into it." This was a lie, of course. I'd heard no such thing. But Master Whitmore, like all my previous masters, trusted that I was simply reporting what I'd heard, that I had no agenda beyond being helpful. "Interesting," Master Whitmore said. "What kind of fertilizer?" "I don't know the details, Master," I said. "Just that it's some new chemical mixture that's supposed to be much better than traditional methods. The slaves said their master paid a lot for it, but the results were worth it." Master Whitmore investigated, found a supplier selling the revolutionary fertilizer I'd mentioned, and invested in it, not knowing that I'd carefully researched which fertilizers were actually harmful to soil health in the long term, which ones would provide short-term benefits but cause long-term degradation. The pattern continued over the next year. I offered advice that seemed helpful but was actually destructive. I made suggestions that appeared to be in Master Whitmore's best interest, but were designed to undermine his success. I positioned myself as loyal and valuable, while systematically destroying the foundation of his prosperity. And Master Whitmore, despite his caution and conservatism, despite his rational approach to management, despite his skepticism about curses and superstition, began to experience the same pattern of decline that had destroyed my previous masters. His livestock became less productive, his crops yielded less than they should have, his investments underperformed, his costs increased while his revenues decreased. "I don't understand it," he said to his wife one evening as I served their dinner. "I'm doing everything right, following the same practices that have worked for 3 generations, but somehow the plantation isn't as profitable as it used to be. It's like something's working against me." "Maybe it's the curse," his wife said, and I saw Master Whitmore's face tighten with irritation. "There's no such thing as a curse, Key," he said firmly. "I'm just making mistakes somehow, missing something. But I'll figure it out, I always do." But he wouldn't figure it out, because the mistakes weren't his, they were mine, carefully disguised as his, invisibly woven into the fabric of his decision-making, impossible to detect because they looked like reasonable choices that simply hadn't worked out. By the fall of 1854, 2 years after Master Whitmore had purchased me, his plantation was in serious trouble. Not as catastrophically ruined as Master Blackwood's had been, Master Whitmore's conservatism had provided some buffer against total collapse, but declining steadily, losing profitability, heading toward the same fate that had befallen all my previous masters. And Master Whitmore was beginning to show the same signs of stress and desperation that I'd seen in Master Blackwood. the same confusion and frustration, the same inability to understand why everything he touched seemed to fail despite his careful management. "Maybe there is something to this curse," he admitted to me one day, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "5 masters, all ruined. That's not coincidence, Samuel, that's a pattern. Maybe you really are cursed." "I don't know, Master," I said, maintaining my facade of innocent confusion. "I just try to do my best. If I'm cursed, I don't know how or why." "Neither do I," Master Whitmore said. "But I can't afford to keep you. I'm going to have to sell you, try to stop the decline before it's too late." And so, in the spring of 1855, I was sold again. The 6th time, now carrying a reputation so firmly established that I was nearly unsellable, that my price had dropped to a mere $50, that auctioneers warned potential buyers about the curse that seemed to follow me. But there was always someone who thought they were smarter, who believed they could succeed where others had failed, who saw opportunity in what others saw as disaster. And as I stood on the auction block, as I prepared to be sold to my 6th master, as I contemplated the years of patient sabotage that lay ahead, I thought about what I'd accomplished. 6 masters, all driven to financial ruin, 6 fortunes destroyed, 6 proud plantation owners reduced to failure and humiliation. And all of it done without stealing a single dime, without destroying a single piece of property in any obvious way, without doing anything that could be traced back to deliberate action. My revenge was perfect, invisible, unstoppable. And it would continue for as long as I lived. For as long as there were masters who thought they could own human beings without consequences. For as long as the system of slavery existed, to be undermined from within. I was Samuel, the cursed slave, the man who destroyed every master who owned him. And I was the most dangerous weapon in the South, not because of violence or rebellion, but because of patience, intelligence, and the subtle art of making masters destroy themselves. The cycle would continue, the revenge would continue, and one master at a time, one fortune at a time, one carefully orchestrated failure at a time, I would make them pay for what they'd done to my father, to my family, to all the countless people who'd suffered under the system of slavery. They called me cursed, but I was something far more dangerous than a curse. I was justice, slow, patient, invisible justice, and I would never stop. This was the story of Samuel, a slave who developed a sophisticated method of economic sabotage that destroyed 6 plantation owners between 1845 and 1855, without ever stealing, without ever committing obvious acts of destruction, without ever doing anything that could be traced back to deliberate action. He used his intelligence and knowledge of agriculture, animal husbandry, and business to offer advice that seemed helpful but was actually destructive, to make suggestions that appeared sound but led to failure, to position himself as loyal and valuable while systematically undermining his master's success. His methods were so subtle that he became known as cursed, with people believing that supernatural forces, rather than deliberate sabotage, were responsible for the pattern of ruin that followed him. He was motivated by revenge for his father, who'd been sold away from the family after trying to buy his freedom. And he dedicated his life to making masters pay for the suffering they'd inflicted on enslaved people. His story became a legend in some circles, though most people never understood that the curse was actually sophisticated economic warfare conducted by a brilliant and patient man who'd found a way to resist slavery that was far more effective than violence or escape. He continued his work until his death in 1872, having destroyed the fortunes of at least 12 plantation owners over his lifetime, proving that resistance could take many forms and that intelligence could be as powerful a weapon as any physical force. The echoes of Samuel's extraordinary revenge reverberate through time, a chilling reminder that resistance takes many forms, that intelligence can be more devastating than violence, and that the most dangerous enemies are often those who appear to be loyal friends. For nearly 3 decades, he perfected the art of invisible sabotage, destroying plantation owners through their own decisions, through advice that seemed helpful but was actually poisonous, through subtle undermining that looked like bad luck or poor judgment. He proved that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated, long-term strategic thinking, that they could weaponize their knowledge and position to strike back at their oppressors in ways that were impossible to defend against because they were impossible to detect. His story challenges every assumption about power and powerlessness, about who controls outcomes, about the nature of resistance under oppression. He turned his apparent loyalty into a weapon, his seeming helpfulness into a tool of destruction, his reputation as cursed into perfect cover for deliberate economic warfare. 12 plantation owners fell to his patient, invisible vengeance. 12 fortunes destroyed, 12 families ruined, 12 proud men reduced to bankruptcy and humiliation, all without a single act of obvious violence or theft. If these untold stories of brilliant strategic resistance resonate with you, join our community. Subscribe to Slave Revenge to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of slavery, stories of those who found creative ways to fight back, who used intelligence as their weapon, who proved that the oppressed could strike devastating blows against their oppressors through patience, planning, and the subtle art of making enemies destroy themselves. Your support ensures these powerful narratives of invisible warfare continue to inspire. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What does Samuel's story teach us about the nature of power and resistance? How do we recognize and honor forms of resistance that operate in shadows and silence? What would you do in his position? Let us know which untold tale you'd like to hear next.